Well, I didn't make this video in January, but who's surprised? Oh well, better late than never. Hi everyone, it's Jenny. Welcome back to my channel. How are you all? I am here to do my favourite non-fiction books of 2020, which is a video I did not do in 2019, which is a shame, but that's past now. I am going through these in the order that I read them, and I will tell you which one is my favourite, but we're just going to get going. Okay, and first up we have Mudlark. Oh wait, was it called Mudlarking? I'm doubting myself now. No, I'm sure it's called Mudlark. Anyway, it's by Lara Maitland, who is obviously a mudlarker. And it's kind of memoir. It's interesting because you're essentially a river scavenger if you're a mudlark. And it's interesting because she talks about how something that used to be, especially in Victorian times, something that the destitute would do. It was, if you were a mudlark, that was really derogatory and you've really fallen on hard times. And now it's become kind of very elitist. There's a society of mudlarks. You have to get a license. You can't always get a license. You have to have one kind of license to get the other kind of license and that kind of thing. So that's interesting about how now it's seen as something that is a treasure hunt, essentially. And she splits and defines the different mudlarkers into hunters and gatherers, and says how the hunters are normally men and they're much more goal focused in what they're trying to find, and we use metal detectors, and the gatherers are usually women, and for them the actual process of searching for finds is just as important as actually finding something. And that is a really just very beautiful image of how you can find solace in finding lost things, and you can lose yourself while finding something and just become engrossed in that activity. And it's just fascinating what she finds, because she moves downriver geographically throughout the chapters from Richmond to the estuary, and it's just a fascinating look at London history and all the different civilizations and empires and countries and trade that have flown through the Thames. And I find it really interesting what she decides to keep as well, and she talks about how you have to report your findings to the Museum of London and that kind of thing, and how she identifies things, but how for her the things that she finds special are signs of imperfections where you can see a human story or a sense of ownership and personalisation, and it's just wonderful to hear what she finds and how it's an adventure every day, because there's new things being brought and taken away by the Thames every day. It's a wonderful, fascinating, calming book about London and history and inheritance and all these things. I just loved it. Then I have At the Pond, Swimming at the Ladies Pond, which is a collection of 14 confessional essays by different women writers, and they're grouped together seasonally. It's wonderful because it's talking about this almost sacred place in London where you can go and be immersed in nature and sort of forget that you're in the city. And it does talk about the other ponds, because there are three. There's a ladies, one for men and one that's mixed. But it talks about the superiority of the ladies' pond and the community of women there, and how it's protected by trees and signs. So it's a sense of a safe place in a city again. It's a really beautiful collection in the different things it explores, and how even though someone is just going to swim there, how they overhear people talking about all of life's loves and losses. And the most beautiful story I think is probably the one by a former lifeguard, and how she talks about how over the years she can almost kind of diagnose people by looking at them and that have gone through some kind of emotional pain, how she sees them heal, and just how she becomes emotionally attuned to people and so empathetic by doing this job is just a beautiful story of humanity, and I loved it. Obviously I loved all these books. Then I have Don't Touch My Hair by Emma Dabiri, which is wonderful on audiobook because she narrates it and she's Irish and it's just a delight. But this is wonderful because she is a biracial woman, and she grew up always feeling a sense of great shame around her hair because it wasn't like a white person's hair, and how she felt othered because of that. And then she uses that feeling of shame to explore the history of racism and colonialism, but linking it to hair is great because it just makes it much more focused. And sometimes you want that, you don't just want an overview of racism and how that affects black people's lives. It's really helpful just to have this focus about this one part of their lives, and how that small thing reflects the bigger problem of racism and the history and legacy of colonialism, about how during slavery they had less time to care for their hair, and how that took away the sense of a community and care, and also about how there's just a lack of black people's history, and or at least there's not much positive examples of black people in history or about their hair, and it's just a really accessible while still being quite academic and, you know, quite nuanced examination of black people's hair, and how doing your hair and caring for it can be almost a political statement, and it's just brilliant. Then, speaking of Irish authors, I have Constellations, Reflections from Life by Shenanigans, which is stunning. So this is in a way about her body and the different illnesses that she's suffered throughout her life. She talks about missing school several years in a row. She talks about the difficulties of being forced into menopause when she was in her 20s, of having 2 very difficult pregnancies. So sometimes it's about particular body parts and what they've suffered, but it's also about politics in a way. She writes that any book about bodies has its own implicit politics, and she discusses at length about how she's often been not believed or taken seriously by male doctors, about how so many of the doctors that she has been treated by have been male and haven't listened to her properly, and how she's sort of become attuned to when they're fobbing her off. And also she talks about the importance to her of birth rights and abortion because of living in Ireland, and she has a chapter about campaigning for abortion with her own daughter, and how important that is to her about making history and women's bodies not being policed or always attached to a womb, about how women's bodies are more than that and they can do more than have a child, and that doesn't define or shouldn't define whether or not you are a woman. And then next up we have Motherwell, A Girlhood by Deborah Orr. This is Deborah, by the way, as a wee bairn, and she is talking about her childhood and adolescence growing up in Motherwell, a quite large town in Scotland, which is just southeast of Glasgow, and she is being brought up by 2 pretty narcissistic parents who, because they're of the Second World War generation, are obsessed with keeping up appearances, and her dad is quite political as well and very traditional gender roles. He likes to boast about how he never misses a day of work. They're sadly not very encouraging of the education and the spark that she shows there, but what's really clever about this book is that it goes through in pretty much objects. So the bureau is the first chapter, and that's this kind of central object in the house that her mother controls, which is where they keep all of their documents and paperwork and memories, and that kind of sentimental memorabilia is all stored there. So it quite often references back to the bureau, and that becomes the foundation of the whole book. Reading it now, we know that she went off to become a successful journalist, so it is partly about her trying to escape this place and go to university and pursue a career while being discouraged by her parents, and also about her hedonism in that time. But what's really clever about this book, I'm sure I've already said that phrase, but it is about not just her life, but something bigger, and I think this is what the most successful memoirs do. They might talk about something very personal, but then it broadens a discussion or a thought in your mind about a wider topic. Then we have a very different kind of memoir. This is Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands by Mary Seacole. And she was a Victorian British Jamaican nurse. I mean, she has also been described as a kind of doctoress. So she was born in Kingston, Jamaica. Her father was Scottish, and her mother was the one who taught her the medical skills. And she spent quite a long time at the beginning of her life in Jamaica, and then went to the Panama Islands where her brother was, and while there a cholera outbreak happened, and she was very successful in nursing patients there. And then when the Korean War broke out, she went to England, offered her services, and was turned down in different offices several times. And that is a particularly heartbreaking point in the book, because she sort of realises that it's not just Americans that are racist, that British are too, just in a more polite way. or indirect way, I suppose. So then she, being a very industrious woman, goes and sets up a British hotel in the Crimean War. And that is very popular with all the officers, and it's kind of like a convalescent home where they can receive treatment or stay. And half the book is about the Crimean War, which is what I knew her for. The other half of the book was still really interesting though, and I learnt a lot. I think she's really special and was the kind of person that, like a lot of women, was forgotten for almost a century, but actually was quite well taken care of while she was alive. She was really not doing well financially, but people raised money for her and had a huge benefit concert for her because of her services in the Crimean War. So she's impressive because she's probably one of the first nurse practitioners. This is probably one of the first black authors to write a book, like a black woman authors to write a book like this. So yeah, it's definitely worth a read. A different Victorian book, if you will. And then I've just realised, like, almost all these books are memoirs. I have a genre in mind. Okay, these are the 2 books, but they're part of a trilogy, so I'm saying this is one. So this is Childhood and Youth by Tove Ditlevsen, who was, a Danish poet who had one of those stereotypically classic, you suffer for your art kind of lives, where she was addicted to substances and alcohol and then committed suicide. So that's sad, but it's a really interesting life, and she writes beautifully, and these have only recently been translated into English, and I've just bought the 3rd part and I'm very flippin' excited because damn, that was hard to find. Anyway, I'm going to put one down because this is sliding around. I can't deal with it. So Tove here was born in 1917 into very few prospects. She's living in a quite down and out area where there are a lot of drunk people around. She only really has the opportunity to sort of marry someone, and everyone is just in fear of the rise of fascism, and her father is constantly losing jobs because of his socialist politics. Obviously you have the shadow of Hitler and the Second World War that become more prominent in the later book, and it's about art and addiction and her burgeoning, is that the right word? Her flourishing, we'll go with that, her flourishing artistic talent. Her prose is really beautifully balanced between simplicity and then gorgeous poetical flourishes. It's just so readable, and it's made me want to go and read her poems. So there we go. Then I have a sweet little book which is Tiny Beautiful Things, which is a collection of advice columns. I think the alias is Sugar, so people write Dear Sugar letters, and the author is Cheryl Strayed, who wrote Wild. That's the only thing I know about her. That was anything I'd at least heard of before. And she's very lovely and calls everyone sweet pea and honey bun, which normally I would find disgusting and soppy, but in this sense it works, I guess. And the questions and dilemmas are really diverse and interesting. Sometimes they're very trivial, sometimes they're, to me, impossible. I have no idea what I would have said to them, but she's just so wise, and it's just really comforting and life-affirming. I listened to it in one night when I couldn't sleep, and it was just delightful. So yeah, I recommend that one if you just want something gentle to listen to. Then something that is not so easy to read, but still worth your time. This is my favourite non-fiction book of the year. This is Last Witnesses, Unchildlike Stories by Svetlana Alexievich, who has won the Nobel Peace Prize. No, the Nobel Prize for Literature. And this is an oral history of people who were children during the Second World War in the Soviet Union. And obviously it's pretty chronological. A lot of the accounts do start the day that the war began, or they were bombed, and then progresses to the end of the war. This format of writing hasn't always been respected, and it's definitely been repressed in Russia. I know that she was in exile for 10 years, and Russia is very intent on protecting and curating, I suppose, their sense of history and what they put out to the world and what they portray as the events that happened. So she's really challenging that in this format. And what's really special about this book is that she doesn't interject or disrupt the narratives that people are describing with any authorial comment. She's just letting people talk. It's much more personal, it's much more encouraging of empathy, I think, and it just gives it this kind of emotional truth, like the Russian novels, the great Russian novels like Anna Karenina try to do. I think it's on that same level in the non-fiction form, so readable and tragic, but also balanced in the sense that while there's such horror in here, there's also such hope and kindness from strangers, and it really shows the best and worst of humanity, and also just the in-between about how some people are just caught in the middle and they're just trying to survive. It's an incredible book. I can't wait to read more by her. Don't mind me, just got pins and needles in my feet. Oh, wait. Okay, that's better. Okay, the next book is probably my second favourite, though I'm not going to rank all of them. This is... Oh, I've still got pins and needles. Okay. Whites on Race and Other Falsehoods by Ortega Uwagba. This is an essay that was written in the wake of George Floyd and his murder, though it has, the author has said in interviews, been on her mind for quite a few years. And it's really challenging, is the main word I would use. She talks about the burden of whiteness and how white people often want to go to a reading list and have some kind of academic understanding of racism, but don't actually take that any further into some kind of positive action. And that's kind of my main point I got from this book, is that white allyship, though it's a good thing, it can often be performative, like on social media, and not actually create any real change, and it can be limiting when people just want to read a book and then not really think about it or engage with it again. And also, one thing I think that is quite different with this book compared to a lot of the other ones that I've read, I don't feel like this is for white people. I feel like as a black person you could read this and get something from it, and that's really important actually, because I think a lot of books kind of are written more towards changing white people, which is still important, but there needs to be discourse that benefits everyone, and I definitely think that this book does that very well. Another really hard-hitting book, this is The Optician of Lampedusa by Emma Jane Kirby, who's a BBC journalist, and she is telling the story of a man that she interviewed who, when he went sailing with his wife and 6 friends, came across an overturned migrant boat, and he and his friends managed to save 47 people, but it was really traumatic because he talked about how they had to play God and they couldn't save everyone, and then by the time the Coast Guards came, everyone else was dead and 360 people drowned. And he talks about the trauma of that, about how it changes his perspective towards refugees, how beforehand he just felt like they were a problem and didn't see them as humans because he just thought of them as something that was scaring off the tourism and therefore affecting the economy of the island. But then suddenly sees the human need and the fear and the desperation to have a better life and just to be safe. And it's incredibly moving and just powerful. I really think it's an important subject, and interesting how he neglects the label of being called a hero for saving these people, because he realises that he is in a place that has done so little to help refugees. What I like about this book is that because it's from the perspective of not a refugee but someone who is observing this crisis, is that it invites you to transcend the voyeurism of watching the news and to actually empathise with people. You really feel like you're there on the boat. She's, the author, not taken a clinical approach to describing the facts. It's written like a real narrative, and you're very immersed in the story and in the experience of them pulling people out of the water. It's just an incredible read. Then the next book is White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo, which my lovely friend Amanda recommended to me. And this is a really important book that I want everyone to read, and it talks about why it's important for white people to understand and acknowledge and discuss racism. She talks about how the definition of racism has become way too narrow and binary, about how it's problematic that we associate people being racist or not, or good or bad, because she really talks about how we all have racial biases and that is just ingrained in us and in our society, and we have to acknowledge that and be able to move past the idea that you are or aren't something, because then we will at least be able to try and start to not become so defensive if we're accused of being racist. One thing I really liked about this book is that she, like, as a white woman, talks about her own failings, about moments when she said something and may have been well-meaning or may have been joking, but it actually was racist, and how it offended someone who was black, and how she resolved that situation. It doesn't feel then and like you're just being told by this perfect omniscient God who's judging you how you should behave. It's about her own human failings and how it's a continuous journey. You know, there isn't one book we can read and then we're done and we've learnt all we need to know, and it's something we have to just constantly unlearn and try and not necessarily tackle because there's not an end point, but just know that you're always interrupting racism, you're always challenging it in your everyday life. And while this is very specific to America, but in terms of the history that she tells about how things changed in the civil rights era, about how because of the peaceful protesting we started to notice is that there was an outcry against racism, and therefore racism sort of went more covert rather than overt and became something that we would say in a more coded way so that it became more acceptable. But it's still there, it's still present, and like I say, while that's very American centric, I still think the whole principle is universal, and the idea of whiteness being so normative and how we often don't even have to acknowledge our race because everything is just made for us and we don't have to be conscious of it in our everyday lives. So it's a really, again, like Whites, is a very challenging read, but super good and informative, and I hope you read it. And then last but not least, ending on a real good one, this is A Room with a View by Virginia Woolf, which is an infamous piece of feminist literary criticism. This was originally delivered as a lecture. Imagine being the first person to hear that lecture. Oh, that must have been so special. The famous quote is, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction." Yes, there we go. I've said that the wrong way around more times than I care to tell you. Thank goodness for editing. But that is the whole premise of this, about how she is arguing that women are not inferior writers, or more importantly, inferior subjects, and that it's really because they have been economically and educationally and socially disadvantaged compared to men, and that's why there aren't so many female greats as there are male. And she's talking about the importance of financial independence and not being weighed down with children and marriage and household duties like men have not really had to deal with, so that they are able to write, and also about how male subjects are often more highly thought of. Like if a book is about war, then that is more praiseworthy than if it's about a woman at home, and how both things are valuable. And she's really encouraging women to go out and write stories of a great variety, and how nothing is too small or not important enough. And there's another really lovely analogy where she talks about the idea of Shakespeare like having a sister, Judith, who is just talented but is overwhelmed and exhausted by the female duties of life. And she's writing a lot of this from the perspective of a fictional character, Mary, who's going to the British Museum to find out everything about women and about women's writing, and uses that again as a framework to show the discrepancies and the inequalities that women have had to put up with for far too long. It's an incredible essay, which is good because I give up on the second one, I'm sad to say. There's another one called Three Guineas, which is much longer and it's about war, and I couldn't be doing with it. I didn't want to ruin the perfection of A Room of One's Own, so I just read that one. I highly recommend, if you are a feminist or a Virginia Woolf fan and you haven't got to this one yet, read it. It's so special. I know I will return to this and read it all over again and enjoy it all over again. But there we go. I hope that wasn't a million hours long. And I really... Oh, pins and needles my foot again. Oh, God. So, yes, I hope that was fun for you. And, yes... Oh, wow, I really kept focusing on pins and needles. Let me know what the best non-fiction book that you read was. I hope to read more equally in terms of non-fiction throughout this year, because I read almost all of these, or at least a good half of them in November, so I would like to read more evenly throughout the year. But we'll see how that goes, and I will see you soon for Bookish Shenanigans. Bye!